The tunnel leading into the old world shimmered with a sickly greenish glow as the group descended deeper into the earth. A single overhead lamp cast ghostly shadows on corroded rails and cavern walls stained by centuries of damp. Fractured metal supports creaked ominously, echoing the party's footsteps. Every breath carried a faint tang of radiation, a bitter and electric scent that stuck to their nostrils. The handful of workers pressed onward, silently steeling themselves for yet another shift in the irradiated cavern. Phalia trudged at the head of the group, boots catching in the uneven gravel. As a daughter of a known miner, she had earned her place in the crews through her father's reputation. She was lean and tall, her frame hardened by the relentless toil of chipping away at crystalline deposits for years. Her face was partly hidden by a makeshift respirator mask, but her eyes remained unblinking, determined. Let the city politicians sit in their high towers, safe from the biting cold and contaminated slums, she often thought. They never saw the travails of those who risked their lives to keep the sputtering generators running. Their footsteps echoed between crumbling walls, punctuated by the low hum of power lines that snaked overhead, relics from an era when people had once thrived in relative comfort. The men and women around Phalia included both veterans and new recruits, dressed in threadbare protective suits, their flashlights flickering in sync with the city's erratic power supply. No one dared to speak aloud about their secret fears, but the tension in the tunnel was nearly palpable. At the mouth of the irradiated cavern, a giant steel gate stood, propped open on ancient hydraulics that hissed with reluctance. Checking a radiation gauge taped to her wrist, Phalia frowned. The levels were creeping beyond normal. She pressed a button under the plastic cover of her suit, toggling on a small generator attached to her back that would filter some of the harmful ionizing particles. It wouldn't make her immune, just less vulnerable. As the workers shuffled through the gate, a new wave of dread swept over them. Even after countless harvests, the luminance of the crystals lying half buried in the stony walls still evoked awe. Specks of violet and turquoise flickered together to create a hypnotic radiance that pulsed gently, as if the cavern itself possessed a heartbeat. Phalia knew better than to stare too long. The crystals had a strange effect on the mind if one gazed too deeply, sparking illusions and brief delirium. A harsh voice broke through the hush of admiration. "Remember your quotas," barked Overseer Tarth. He stood atop a raised metal platform that jutted from the cavern wall. "The city's on the brink again, another blackout in the upper burrows, another wave of sickness in the outskirts. We need more crystals. No slacking." Tarth's face was half covered by an old mechanical visor. An elongated lens slid open and shut over his right eye, capturing data that he used to track each worker's yield. He was rumored to have survived a radiation blast long ago, which left him dependent on the ocular device for vision. Power-hungry and brusque, Tarth pushed everyone to their limits, sometimes beyond. The silence that followed his command spoke volumes about the fear and resentment people felt. Phalia glanced at the pickaxe strapped to her belt. The old tool had a wooden handle wrapped in patched leather, and the end was rusted from years of hacking into radioactive veins. She slung it over her shoulder and headed toward a small cluster of partially exposed crystals. With measured strokes, she began to chip at the brittle rock. Each strike sent a jolt through her arms and a small volley of chips dancing across the ground. The labor was punishing in its monotony. The clang of steel against stone merged with the hiss of stagnant vapor pockets releasing from deep within the cavern. Now and then a worker let out a muffled curse upon cutting a hand or dislodging a crumbly boulder onto a steel toe. Phalia's breath came in ragged pulls, the respirator mask heating up uncomfortably against her mouth and nose. Sweat poured down her forehead to gather at her chin before dripping onto the cave floor. She chipped and gathered the shards in a lead-lined carrier by her feet, its heavy lid protecting her from the brunt of the radiation that the crystals emitted. Yet even with these measures, Phalia could feel the sting of radiation burn flushing her arms. Her vision blurred every so often, and she'd have to stop, blinking rapidly, until the wave of dizziness subsided. She wasn't alone. Around her, a few miners occasionally sat down to steady themselves or gulp from a battered canteen. Each flicker of the city's overhead lights reminded them of their predicament. The old grid was near collapse. barely supported by the energy extracted from the crystals after they were refined. Many believed this method of sustaining the city was ultimately a futile endeavor. The crystal's power was immense, but overuse led to rapid depletion, and each harvest grew more difficult. Yet Tarth and the city council relentlessly sacrificed bodies and minds in the pursuit of that last spark to avoid final darkness. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Philia lost track of time in the gloom, focusing only on the harsh rhythm of work. She chipped, scraped, and lugged. Her mind wandered to home. If the cramped, mold-ridden apartment she shared with her younger brother could even be called a home. She pictured him huddled beside the small generator, hoping to glean a bit of warmth. The token she earned here would put half-stale bread on the table and keep them alive, though for how long she couldn't say. Suddenly, a tremor rippled through the cavern. It was subtle at first, a slight vibration underfoot. Then, abruptly, the ground heaved, sending miners sprawling. A roar reverberated through the tunnels. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling in choking clouds. Philia crouched, arms over her head. Days of terror rippled through her veins. Cave hands were not uncommon here, and the consequences were often fatal. Her heart hammered. She heard Tarth shouting above the commotion, ordering everyone to stay calm, to find stable ground. The flickering overhead lights wavered more wildly now, threatening to go out entirely. In the chaotic half-darkness, Philia scrambled to locate her lead-line chariot. It toppled over, releasing shards of crystal that glowed on the rocky floor. She seized the handle and dragged it behind a jagged wall outcropping, hoping to shield herself from tumbling stones. The rumble subsided, leaving only the hiss of shifting dust. Slowly, the survivors began to stand, coughing and sputtering. Tarth's voice cut through the silence again. "Call the damaged sensors. Someone check the structural beams." A few senior miners stumbled toward the metal pillars that lined the entry to the cavern. Philia rose unsteadily, scanning the gloom. Some workers lay on the ground, nursing injuries. One man clutched his arm in agony, while a woman limped over to assist him. Others seemed dazed, leaning against the pulsating cave walls. Philia steadied her breath, her senses returning. The quake felt unnatural, more than just the usual instability of these old, battered mineshafts. She stepped gingerly around a newly created fissure in the ground, heading toward one of her friends, a middle-aged miner named Darren. He was sitting, pale-faced, near a large fracture of purple crystal. His pickaxe lay broken at his side. "You all right?" Philia asked, kneeling next to him. "Arm's bruised," Darren muttered through gritted teeth, "but I'll live. Scared me half to death, though." A wave of relief washed over Philia, but she knew any aftershock could still finish the job. Across from them, Tarth's mechanical eye whirred as it swept the cavern. "We can't afford to lose this vein, or our nerve," he shouted. "Get back to work, unless you're pinned. Medical teams will be here soon." Philia clenched her jaw. She hated Tarth, though she also recognized the harsh logic. The city needed the crystals, or their generator systems would fail. And if the city went dark, there would be nowhere to run. Outside the walls was a wasteland of ruins and toxic storms. No one survived out there, not for long. As the group slowly resumed their labor, Philia remembered how, in quieter times, some people had dreamed of finding a safer energy source. Yet the city council insisted the crystals were their only option. Rumors circulated of new technology or even pockets of surviving farmland beyond the horizon, but no one dared attempt a great migration. With so little reliable power, breaks in communication were frequent, and the risk of an exodus was deemed too high. So they stayed, tethered to these luminous stones that poisoned them, body and soul. The quake had dislodged a new cluster of crystals, bigger than any Philia had seen. Jagged columns glimmered near the back of the cavern in a newly opened section. The color there was not the usual violet or turquoise, but a swirling, chaotic blend. An intense radiance bled from the exposed crystals, pulsing faster than the rest. Philia stumbled toward them, enthralled and alarmed. She was no scientist, but she recognized this was a rare find, possibly an even purer source of power. She reached the deposit, her respirator stifling her short gasps. Carefully, she tapped the vein with her pickaxe. A hissing sound erupted, and a faint plume of phosphorescent dust drifted into the stale air. Immediately, Felia's vision blurred with swirling lights, and the ground seemed to tilt. She coughed, stepping back from the crystals. Tarth was suddenly beside her, his metallic visor clicking as he scanned the deposit. "We need these," he said curtly. "This is the largest cluster I've seen in years. If we extract it, we could power the city for months." Felia's head was still spinning. I'm not sure if it's stable," she managed. "That haze, the radiation might be off the charts." "Doesn't matter. We harvest everything." Tarth jabbed a gloved finger toward her, emphasizing each word. "Understood?" She nodded mutely, though her heart thundered in protest. With her father gone, carried away years ago by radiation sickness, she had no illusions about the Council's priorities. They would strip this cavern bare if it promised another day of flickering lights for their gilded precincts. Summoning her courage, Felia raised her pickaxe again, braced her feet on the rock, and struck the glittering surface. Jagged fractures appeared across the crystal's surface, and a thunderous crack rang out. At first, she feared another quake, but instead, an enormous chunk detached from the wall. With some effort, she and 3 other miners lowered it to the ground, wincing as they felt the heat pulsing through their protective suits. She could almost imagine the city's lights flaring in triumph miles above them. The chunk was massive, bigger than a crate, with swirling highlights that flickered like living embers. Felia's mind swam with the same swirl of color. If she looked too closely, she swore she saw shapes dancing inside the crystal, as if it contained entire constellations. She forced herself to look away, focusing on guiding the chunk into a reinforced container. As Felia and the others secured the find, Tarth declared a mandatory break, likely not for their health, but to plan the transportation of such a large cache. Workers collapsed onto piles of rock or hunched over half-empty water jugs, inhaling the stale subterranean air. More than one coughed violently, spitting blood-tinged phlegm from ravaged lungs. Survival was a grim game here, waged day by day. Felia unlatched her respirator and took a cautious sip of water. She could almost feel tumors forming in her body, invisible seeds planted by the radiation that gnawed at their flesh. She gazed at her coworkers, at the flickering lights that threatened to plunge them into darkness, and felt a swell of fury. There had to be some other way to live. "I heard stories," whispered Darren, sidling up to her. "Some say beyond the city walls, past the northern range, there's a valley untouched by radiation, that the storms don't reach there, that the land is fertile." His eyes shone with a desperate hope that Felia couldn't ignore. "You really believe that?" Felia asked. She'd heard similar rumors but never put much stock in them. Everyone was always spinning tales of salvation. Yet, looking at the monstrous chunk of crystal, she couldn't help but wonder if clinging to that hope was better than rotting underground. Before Darren could answer, Tarth's voice boomed again. "Break's over. Prep to move out with our haul. This is more than enough for the day. Let's not push our luck." The group mobilized. Carefully, they loaded the valuable crystals onto low carts rigged with anti-shock harnesses. Originally designed for fragile cars, Felia found herself at the front once more, gripping the cart's handle and leaning into it with all her weight. The wheels screeched in protest, half-rusted bearings complaining at the load. Tarth walked alongside, scanning the path for any more quakes or collapses. They made their way back through the labyrinth of tunnels, flashlights bobbing in half-circles against stone walls. The power overhead fluctuated violently. At one point, it died entirely, plunging them into pitch blackness that lasted for several stretches of panicked breathing. Then, with a sputter and a pop, the weak lighting returned. Companions shivered in relief, though everyone knew the city's grid was failing and one day would not restart. Finally, the group reached the main checkpoint, a thick steel door leading to an elevator shaft that would haul them and their spoils back up to the city's industrial district. 2 guards in tattered gas masks stood watch, scanning everyone with handheld counters. The numbers started flashing furiously, revealing that several workers had spiked radiation levels. Alarmed, the guards signaled for the high readings to be taken aside. A hush fell. Those singled out would be quarantined, and likely never seen again. Philia held her breath as the guard waved the device over her suit. The meter beeped loudly, but not as rapidly as for some of the others. Still, the guard shook his head at her. "You're right on the edge. Check in with the medics upstairs," he said in a muffled tone. Her stomach tightened, but at least she wasn't being pulled aside right now. Tara's voice echoed officiously in the corridor. "Hurry it up. We need to get that load onto the lift in the next 10 minutes. With a squeal of old brakes, the elevator arrived, an expansive metal platform with rusted guardrails. The group maneuvered their precious cargo aboard, then crowded around it, holding onto rails or crates. The operator, a heavy-set woman in a patched uniform, opened a control panel to engage the mechanism. A jolt and rattling chains announced their ascent. Philia gazed around at her fellow miners, grim, battered figures coated in dust and residue, faces etched with exhaustion. The slow climb upwards always reminded her of her father, who once told her that coming back into the light should be the triumphant part of the day. Now it felt more like returning to a decaying tomb. At last, the platform clanked into position against a docking ledge. Automated arms locked onto the lift, and the group disembarked. The industrial district extended ahead, a sprawl of sheet metal shacks and towering conduits. Overhead, the sky was barely visible, obscured by smog and swirling ash from burn pits. People in stained coveralls moved about, too weary for conversation. Automated drones buzzed overhead, scanning for intruders or suspicious behavior. A relentless aura of hopelessness seemed to permeate the thick air. Philia and 2 other workers were tasked with hauling the largest cluster directly to the city's energy lab. She wanted nothing more than to collapse somewhere and sleep, but Tarth's bark was unwavering. "Move it. If we can process this chunk fast, we might avert the next blackout." They lugged the container through twisting walkways. Once they arrived at the lab's corrugated metal entrance, a pair of scientists, pale and frantic, rushed forward to take possession of the glowing cargo. "This is remarkable," one breathed, eyes flickering with an unsettling combination of greed and fascination. "The output from this deposit might be exponentially higher." Philia watched as they carted the crystal chunk into a sealed containment chamber, where whirring machines awaited, presumably to break down and refine the energy. She wondered how much power it would truly yield, and whether it would be enough. Part of her wished it wouldn't, if only to put an end to the endless cycle of forced harvests and imminent decay. She'd lost family, friends, and her own health was teetering. For what? Another day or 2 of half-lit corridors? A sudden hush fell as Tarth approached, her visor glinting. "Report to the medical wing," he ordered. "We can't afford more sickness among our ranks." She nodded, swallowing her anger, and trudged away. The medical facility was a series of canvas-walled cubicles erected around the shell of an old warehouse. Lines of coughing, feverish patients snaked through the area. Overworked nurses tried to handle them with meager supplies. Philia waited in grim silence, her limbs shaking from exhaustion. At last she was directed to a nurse with clipped hair and tired eyes. Radiation scanners beeped around her, measuring the invisible toxins in her body. The nurse stifled a sigh. "The levels are high. We can administer a dose of the standard anti-rad medication, but it's rationed. You want it, or do you want to wait and see if you can flush it from your system on your own?" Philia's temples throbbed. She knew the medication might help delay the inevitable, but she also knew the city was running out of everything. Perhaps it was foolish, but she shook her head. Save it for someone worse off. The nurse didn't argue. Supplies were short, and Philia had the right to refuse. "Get some rest," the woman said softly. "There's a tent out back. You should lie down." "That's it?" Philia asked bitterly, but the nurse's blank expression said it all. The system had no more to give. A somber hush followed Philia as she left, wending her way through the labyrinthine aisles of cots that reeked of infection and despair. Eventually, she emerged behind the warehouse, where a few tattered tents and tarps had been set up. She found an empty cot and lowered herself onto it, arms trembling. Her head ached. She coughed dryly, tasting metal on her tongue. She closed her eyes, feeling the city's sorrow weigh upon her like a physical force. Sleep came in fits, haunted by fevered dreams. A child's face, her brother's, twisted in hunger, swirling colors in the crystals, forming monstrous shapes. The city's towers flickering in the night sky before collapsing into dust. She woke several times with her heart hammering and the metallic tang of radiation thick on her lips. When daylight finally broke through the cracks in the tent's roof, it provided only a pallid glow. Outside, the thick smog glowed orange, a permanent mockery of a sunrise. Philia felt a dull resignation as she rose, every joint protesting. She splashed tepid water on her face from a plastic bucket, then made her way back to the industrial sector. Like countless others, she had to stand in line for ration tickets. She spoke numbly to the official distributing them, who stamped a flimsy piece of paper and handed it back with equal detachment. Another day, another meager meal. She paused on her way to the distribution center, hearing raised voices down a side alley. Cautiously, she peered around the corner. A small group of workers, including Darren, stood in a tense huddle. He caught sight of her and waved her over. "What's going on?" she asked quietly, stepping closer. Another quake caused a partial collapse up top. "People say more crystal veins got destroyed," Darren explained, eyes flicking nervously around. "And Tarth's planning a deeper expedition tomorrow some spot that's even more irradiated. Word is, the city's bigger generators are failing faster than expected. They need another big haul." Philia felt a surge of fear shot through with deep anger. "They're gonna kill us down there. Each trip gets worse." A younger worker spat in disgust. "We're forced into those mines, but maybe it's time we do something else. Leave, maybe." Philia mulled over the idea. Was it madness to flee the city and risk the toxic wastes for some rumor of a fertile valley? Or was it madness to keep dying by degrees, enslaved to crystals that devoured their body? Though her father's warnings about the dangers beyond the walls had once frightened her, she now saw the city itself had become a prison. Without words, Philia, Darren, and the others looked at each other. Some nodded in silent agreement. A plan was forming, tentative but charged with desperation and hope. Philia wondered if Tarth or his superiors suspected that a band of fed-up workers might slip away at night. Perhaps it wouldn't matter if they tried, though the city guards and roving drones made it perilous. "We'll meet again tonight," Darren murmured, stepping closer to Philia. "By the old cargo exit. Spread the word carefully. We'll see who's brave enough to come." She exhaled, a small sense of possibility sparking within her. For so long she had felt trapped in a grim cycle, but maybe there was another path, even if it was fraught with unknown dangers. At least it offered a chance for something beyond crushing labor. Agreeing to keep watch and move discreetly, they parted ways. Philia continued on her route, collecting her paltry ration of bread and a nearly expired can of protein sludge. She tasted bile in her throat at the prospect of tomorrow's expedition. Tarth's demands would continue until they scrapped every last crystal from the radioactive depths, no matter how many workers they lost. The day wore on. Machinery groaned and whirred. Overhead speakers crackled with propaganda about sustaining the city. A few times, Tarth's voice commanded Philia or other miners to assemble for briefings, but each time she found an excuse or slipped into a crowd. Her heart beat wildly at the thought that she was forfeiting her official duty to mine, though, in truth, she doubted the city had the resources to track everyone's movements with total accuracy. Night fell, though the sky remained a dull haze. Philia, worn and weary, made her way to the rendezvous point by the cargo exit. Nestled behind towering stacks of rusted metal crates, the door was rarely used except to unload scrapped vehicles. The stench of decaying fuel hung thick in the air. A few others were already there, glancing around nervously. Darren waved her over. In total, 7 of them huddled together. Philia's heart pounded. Every nerve felt alive with fear. If they were caught, Tarth might have them exiled or worse. But if they succeeded, they might break free from the city's hopeless cycle. Darren produced a handheld map display, battered but functional. "I scavenged it from a downed drone," he whispered. It shows topography outside the walls. Look, there's a region around 70 miles northeast that might have lower radiation readings. 70 miles of wasteland. Julia felt a ripple of dread. They had limited supplies, questionable stamina, and no guarantee of success. Yet somehow that patch of land, unverified, possibly uninhabitable, beckoned to them like a miracle. The group exchanged glances, each fighting their own misgivings. At last, Darren nodded. "We leave now. We avoid the watchtowers by slipping through the old drainage trench to the east. If the city's sensors are relaying minimal movement, we might slip under the radar." No one said a word, but they all started moving, hearts hammering. Philia kept pace with Darren, feeling for the first time in years that she walked with purpose. They skirted the edges of the loading docks, stepping over fallen steel beams and circumventing the guard tower's sweeping searchlights. Miraculously, no alarms sounded. The city around them slept in the uneasy hush of a flickering power cycle, oblivious to the handful of souls who dared to dream of real daylight. They reached a jagged hole in the perimeter fence, the metal so corroded that it crumbled at the touch. One by one, they slipped through. On the other side was a dead expanse of cracked earth, faintly illuminated by a ghostly moon. The air tasted sharp, almost metallic, yet it carried a strange promise. Philia turned to look back at the city's faint glow behind them, thinking of all those left behind, of the crystals that powered and poisoned in equal measure. A shard of resolve ablaze in her chest, she faced forward again, into the dark, unknown expanse. Whatever lay ahead, be it savage storms, roving bandits, or mere emptiness, at least it wouldn't be the slow demise. And so, with silent determination, they set out, leaving behind the twisted labyrinth of caverns and the faint, dying glow of those precious crystals. It was time to search for a different kind of light.